Good afternoon. I'm Greg Krasovsky. I'm an attorney based in Washington, D.C., and a former police officer. Today I was asked to give some comments on a lawsuit that was filed in New York State's Albany County against Mike Tyson, the famous boxer. The lawsuit was filed under the New York's recent Adult Survivors Act, which permits adult survivors of sexual violence to file lawsuits, no matter how long ago they happened, as long as the victim had reached the age of 18. For those victims who were assaulted before they turned 18, they have the separate act that deals with child survivors of sexual crimes. But this particular law gives these individuals, no matter how long ago the alleged sexual assault happened, the right to file a lawsuit within a 1-year window. Since the law was put on the books last year, obviously any victims who have outstanding civil claims in regard to sexual torts that were committed against them must file a lawsuit fairly recently. The law has also changed the statute of limitations on crimes like this, on torts like this, for up to 20 years. But that's not retroactive. Getting back to Mike Tyson's situation, as many of you may remember, Mike Tyson has already been convicted of rape, was convicted of rape back in the early 1990s, based on the allegations of Ms. Desiree Washington. She was a beauty pageant contestant and winner, and she alleged that Mike Tyson had raped her in Indianapolis. He was convicted of that. The evidence in that case, as in many acquaintance rape cases, mostly, in my opinion, it's basically based on the credibility of the accuser and other circumstantial evidence regarding both the accuser and the accused. Ms. Washington stated that she had gone up to Mike Tyson's hotel room and he forced her to have sex against his will, pushed her down in the bed. Now, needless to say, back in the early 1990s, Mike Tyson, aside from being a boxing champion, was a pretty strong guy. So he wouldn't have any problems knocking someone down, especially a woman who may, weigh half of what he weighs, down in the bed and force them to have sex. In rape cases, we look for physical evidence of an assault, of resistance, bruises, scratches, both on the victim and the perpetrator. In acquaintance rape cases, where physical force that would have left marks was not applied, then the question is, how was the victim forced into sexual intercourse? Was the victim, unable to say no if she was unconscious or sleeping? Was the victim psychologically forced based on the perceived threat of force being used against him or her, or the presence of a weapon, things like that, intimidation by a weapon? In Mike Tyson's case, what we have in terms of circumstantial evidence is, if I remember the case correctly, Miss Washington had gone to the bathroom in the hotel room, and apparently she was menstruating at the time, and she had taken out her tampon. And so there were questions in regard to that. Was that indicative of her preparing to engage in consensual sexual relations with Mike Tyson? Or was that simply because she needed to take out the tampon because it was full? But she didn't put in a replacement. I don't remember if she had a replacement on her or not, or whether she had applied any other female, sanitary products, napkins, things like that, pads. But if you look at how juries and judges and prosecutors treat these cases, they obviously look at also, for better or for worse, at the character of both the accused and the accuser, as well as their relationship at the time. If, for instance, the relationship was such that the parties have already had sex before, numerous times on a regular basis, and there are no bruises or other physical evidence that indicates that the victim was forced, it's, all you really have to go on is the victim's word. If, for instance, the accused has a propensity for violence, has previous violent acts against other women, or sexual violence, or a history of forcing women to do things they did not want to do, regardless of whether they've pressed charges or not, based on the evidence given, statements given by previous women, that can sway a prosecutor, a judge, and a jury to make them believe that the accused did in fact commit the crime, since he has a propensity to do so. Although in criminal law, often objections will be raised as to whether it's something like this is admissible, whether it's pertinent, whether it speaks or towards what we call the MO, the modus operandi of the crime. In this case, we have a civil lawsuit against Mike Tyson. The victim has asked for $5 million in damages for pain, emotional suffering she has suffered then and since, inability to have normal relationships, if I recall correctly, problems with sexual relations, things like that. The circumstances of the present lawsuit indicate that, based on the statements in the complaint, the victim was with her female friend talking to Mike Tyson and his limousine driver. Her female friend had to go pick up her car. Mike Tyson said, "Hey, sure, she can go pick up her car and we'll take you there." And I guess she welcomed the opportunity, was convinced to get a limousine ride with Mike Tyson. Based on her statements, once they were in the limousine, he tried to kiss her. She resisted. Then he took off her pants and violently raped her. That's that. In cases like this, there can be two versions of the story, the victim's version and the accused version. Where the truth lies, well, as they say, only God knows. But in this case, let's assume that the victim is telling the truth. That once she had entered the limousine, she did not agree to be kissed, groped, fondled, or whatever by Mike Tyson. But he did it anyway, and then, using his strength and the opportunity, took off her pants and raped her. Violently, she states. Obviously in the presence of the limo driver who was operating the vehicle, who in this case either didn't object or didn't know what was going on in the back of the limousine. But I would assume if this was a violent rape, the limo driver should have heard the commotion, and perhaps his testimony will be crucial in this case. From Mike Tyson's point of view, if he denies the allegations, and I think he will, if the incident took place at all, he may say it never happened, or he may say it happened, but it was consensual. And then you can also cast doubt on the victim's recollection or recounting of events. It's not that easy to take off a woman's pants without using force, especially tight jeans or things like that. There would have been a struggle, there would have been signs, bruises. Did the victim report this to anyone? Did any of her friends, loved ones, or relatives see her afterwards with any bruises? Things like that. Why didn't she scream for help? The limo driver would have heard it. Why didn't she try to get out of the limo, for instance, when it had stopped at a light? Cars do stop at lights occasionally, at intersections. So we'll see what happens. But we always have to be cognizant of the fact that you're innocent until you're proven guilty. If this is a criminal proceeding, here we have a civil proceeding. In the civil proceeding, the burden of proof is lower than in a criminal proceeding where you have to prove someone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, right? And the jury has to vote unanimously for a conviction, or the judge has to find the individual guilty. That's the beyond the reasonable doubt standard in criminal prosecutions. In civil prosecutions, civil lawsuits, you have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, which means, 50.1% of the evidence is on your side, you've prevailed. And you also have to convince either a jury or a judge in a civil proceeding. So here, I think what we're going to have is a situation where if this lawsuit goes forward, I think the decision is going to be made based on the credibility of the witnesses. The victim, any of her witnesses to whom she reported this crime or who may have been there, for instance, the friend with whom she was waiting for a limo, and she, I'm assuming, met afterwards after the incident and perhaps told what happened, or any other individuals that she recounted her story to. For instance, testimony of any medical healthcare professionals that the victim could have gone to seek assistance. They're also going to, I think, use testimony of other women in Mike Tyson's life. Unfortunately, if you remember, you have already a convicted rapist, regardless of whether Mike Tyson denies his guilt. And I think the testimony of Desiree Washington may be sought by the plaintiff and her attorneys. You also had divorce proceedings between Mike Tyson and Robin Givens where he admitted to physical altercations with her, where I think he said, we hit each other. She hit me, I hit her. And Robin Givens has also testified that Mike Tyson was at times violent toward her. So here you already have a history of violence, as they say, right? Not to confuse with the movie title. In terms of the consequences of, for instance, false complaints or false allegations, yes, unfortunately, in this field, people file false complaints and false allegations of sexual assault, sexual abuse, for various motives. The financial motive can be a very powerful one. Or, for instance, to gain advantage in custody proceedings, which we see in family law. And often the individual who makes these accusations, who turned out to be false or exaggerated, they're not punished. Rarely would you have a case where someone is going to be punished financially or even criminally for filing a false complaint. Because in cases like this, we have to defer to the perception of the victim. If the victim perceived that she was victimized, that she was forced to have sexual relations against her will, regardless of what the finder of fact determines later down the road, we have to respect that perception. You can't punish people for their emotional perception of events, or their interpretation of events, of what constitutes consent, what doesn't constitute consent, right? Of how people play active and passive roles, of how people resist or not resist. These are all complicated issues that have to be treated on a case-by-case basis. So this is something that's extremely subjective and can play out either to the benefit of the victim, the accuser, or to the benefit of the defendant, the accused. Defendant in either criminal or civil proceedings. Regarding the fact that so much time has transpired, talking about in the early 90s, a big question is, well, did this happen? We're assuming it would have happened before Mike Tyson was jailed and convicted of the rape in Indianapolis, right? If so, then why didn't the victim, who has chosen to maintain her anonymity, because she's afraid that if her identity is revealed, it'll subject her to more emotional harm and pain and suffering. Why didn't the victim come forward back then during the Desiree Washington, Mike Tyson's rape trial, and provide her testimony? That's a valid question. If this happened after Mike Tyson was released from prison, this would have been If I'm not mistaken, Mike Tyson did, I think, close to 3 years in prison. Well, did she know? I think everyone at that point knew that Mike Tyson had already done a sentence for rape. Do you willingly get into a vehicle with a rapist? These are questions. It doesn't excuse if a forceful rape was committed, in no way, but it also brings into question, the mindset of the victim. Perhaps she didn't know. And if this happened after Mike Tyson's conviction and after his release, would he have done something like this, having spent time in prison? I don't think he was in any rush to go back or subject himself to risk, especially since he maintained his innocence and would have known the consequences even of a false complaint. That based on the false allegation of rape, it'll be even easier to convict you this time since you already have a prior record, and you'll go back into prison again. So these are valid questions. 30 years have gone by pretty much. Are any of these witnesses available? Are they alive? Can they be found? Do they remember what happened? Whether it's the victim's friends, relatives, people she sought assistance from, whether it's medical, psychological assistance, perhaps, advice from a spiritual advisor, reverend, a priest, pastor, things like that. Also, Mike Tyson's end. How about the limo driver? Is he available to testify? Does he remember what happened? Did he hear anything? And what witnesses are going to bring to overcome certain presumptions that are going to be made against you, or certain assumptions based on your prior rape conviction, and based on your history of domestic violence with Robin Givens. So these are all pertinent questions that need to be addressed. Aside from the Mike Tyson case, the present case, I think in general, what we really need to remember and keep in mind is that when it comes to acquaintance or date rape cases, I think we have to be very careful before making any judgments. As they say, before all the evidence is in and has been analyzed. Preferably in a court of law, right? Not in a court of public opinion, heaven forbid. Because in acquaintance rape cases, especially in cases where the victim and the accused have already been in prior consensual sexual relations, the question is, well, in this particular instance, that has led to the complaint being filed against the accused, either a criminal complaint or a civil complaint. Well, was there consent again? Or was there regret? Regret does not give you grounds for filing allegations of rape, either civilly or criminally, right? You may regret having sex with someone. You may regret having unprotected sex. You may regret having a certain type of sex, whether it's oral or deviant. Let's not go into the details. But that's not the issue. The issue has to be, were the requirements for a forced sexual assault, for a forced rape, the formal requirements, were they met? Did someone force you to do something against your will? Did they force you physically? Also, did they force you, in addition to that, psychologically? Someone says, well, I was only forced psychologically. The question is, well, what do you mean? Someone made you have sex through guilt? Or saying, well, if you don't have sex with me, I'll break up with you? Or, if you don't have sex with me, I'll divorce you? I mean, what happened? Because psychological pressure is not the same as the formal requirement that physical force be used, or the threat of physical force be used in rape cases. So these are issues that need to be considered, as well as the prior history of both the victim and the accused. If you have a victim who before this particular incident, never had sex before with that individual, or in general, perhaps was a virgin, then it certainly adds credibility to his or her complaint that this is someone who didn't have intention of having sexual relations. Was the victim under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time and unable to recall what happened, unable to make rational decisions, or unable to give informed consent to having sex? When I mean informed consent, I think we're talking about rational consent that you can make while you're still conscious and can put two and two together, right? Not when you're so high on drugs or so inebriated that you can't even walk or stand. That's a different issue. Also, history of prior relationships, of prior complaints, of prior accusations. Those may be relevant either to the defense or to the prosecution, right, the plaintiff side. Same thing when it comes to the conduct of the accused. Prior conduct, prior history, testimony from the accused's co-workers, people that know him or her intimately, whether there was any propensity towards violence or forcing someone into sexual relations through physical force, threat of force, or psychological force. The other thing we have to keep in mind is we still have a firearms issue in the U.S. The issue is straightforward. We have the right to bear arms. It's very explicit. And we have more, I think, some of the studies say we have more firearms than people in the country, right? So what happens if you have a firearm in the home or in the business? And the accuser says, well, I was psychologically pressured into having sex because I know that the accused has a firearm in their residence or in their place of business where the incident, where the assault took place, even if the firearm was never displayed in a threatening manner or was never even alluded to by the accused. Have sex with me or I'll pull out my gun. I'll go get my gun. I'll get my shotgun. Well, what happens in a situation like this? Can that be used against the accused? The fact that the accused was lawfully owning and storing a firearm in the location of the sexual incident. Something to consider for firearm owners. Can that be used against you? Or should it ever be used against you? I mean, heck, everyone in their house has a knife, right? We have kitchen knives, we have scissors, hatchets, some people have saws, chainsaws. Just the fact that you have in your household or in the location where the incident took place, items that could be used as offensive weapons does not make it a realistic threat of their being used, unless this has been exclusively, like I said, alluded to by the accused, mentioned, or there's a history of the accused using these things. Imagine if the accused is a hunter and the victim says, I'm afraid of him because, heck, he kills deer. He was bragging about how he killed deer, boars, bears, whatever. And I think he's a cold-blooded killer because he has no compunctions against, killing animals. What if he did the same thing to me? Food for thought for those who are hunters. Will that or should that ever be used against you, right? Also, issues of positions of authority. Imagine if you're in a position of authority. For instance, you're a public figure, a politician, or you're in law enforcement, or in corrections. And the victim says, well, I was pressured into having sex because this is someone that potentially has power and authority over me, or has connections, where people that he or she knows could potentially do me harm. Should that ever be used against the accused, if this is their legitimate professional livelihood. I'm not talking about membership, in organized crime, the mafia or a drug cartel, right? We're talking about lawful employment in industries where perhaps you do have authority over people, whether it's law enforcement or corrections, or you're a prosecutor or whatever. You can have position of authority through work or employment, and this is something to consider. Imagine if you work at the same company and the accused has a higher position than the accuser. The accuser may not report to that individual. They may not even work in the same department or unit, but there may be that issue where the victim says, well, I was afraid if I didn't have sex with him, since he's so high up in the organization or the company, this could have had detrimental effects on my work. And I'm not talking about workplace employment harassment. I'm talking about after work, somewhere else. People know each other separately from work, but nevertheless they work at the same organization or an affiliated organization, right? That's something to consider. And the whole issue is, should this ever be used against the accused? If you are engaged, as I've said before, in lawful employment, and what happens when you have financial issues? What happens when you have immigration status issues? Someone says, well, I was afraid if I didn't have sex with the individual, he or she would report me to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and have me deported, right? Or have my visa revoked. Or I would lose other immigration benefits. I'd never get a green card. I'd never get U.S. citizenship. Legitimate issues, right? Because what we're dealing with now are shades of extortion. And if the victim brings forth the allegation, I was forced to have sex because I was being extorted. If you don't have sex with me, I will distribute negative information about you. That will have negative consequences, or I'll report you to someone. That can be a legitimate concern, and that can be compelling if the consequences of the report or the distribution of negative information can be severe, right? So this is blackmail for all practical purposes. In acquaintance date rapes, which are very difficult cases, both civilly and criminally, there are many things at play. So, as an attorney, when I'm approached by a victim, we go through all those things with the victim to see how strong their case is for either civil prosecution or for presentation to the police or the prosecutors for criminal prosecution of the perpetrator. When I'm retained by someone who's being accused of a sex crime, we go through all these issues as well. And I explain to the potential defendant, my client, that look, lots of things are going to be taken into consideration, not just physical evidence, but also circumstantial evidence. Also, your history, your character, evidence and testimony from people you've known before, who can shed light on whether you were capable of doing something like this, or you've done something similar like this in the past. So for both sides, it's important to seek, experienced and competent legal advice before proceeding. In a case like this, where the clock is ticking and you have this limited window of opportunity, now I hate to use the word opportunity, but you have this limited window to file a lawsuit within the 1 year some period after this adult survivor law has gone into effect, or for something that has happened way past the statute of limitations, 30 years ago, then the pressure is on. But the incentives also exist for a potential false complaint, because you have a public figure who has substantial assets, relatively speaking. Right? I mean, not be a billionaire, but still has substantial assets, and already has a history of physical domestic violence and has a history of a felony conviction for rape. So these are all factors that I think the plaintiff's attorneys took into account and probably convinced the victim and her attorneys to go forward with this case. On Mike Tyson's end, if he's not guilty of what he's being accused of, obviously I wish him the best of luck. And let's hope that truth and justice prevails in this case. But he's going to have to overcome some presumptions that are working against him, including his prior criminal record and the history of domestic violence that he himself admitted to, not just his ex-wife, Robin Givens. With all said and done, I guess the good news is that he's not facing another criminal prosecution. This is only a civil case. That's not going to, even if he loses, all he's going to do is lose money. He's not going to lose his freedom and face incarceration again. That's the most important part. Thank you. If only the remote worked.